There's a point in every Christian's life where they really have to check their relationship with God to really kind of examine where they are in that relationship. And a lot of times when we're in relationships, there's this dependability that we have with people that we love or we grow to, will depend on. And most Christians and most churches have a relationship with God where they're speaking harshly against Him. They're not fearing Him, they're fearing the world. And they essentially wander around the wilderness, really in fear of the promise that God has for them. And then instead of going and confronting the things that stand in the way of that promise, they decide that they would rather go back into slavery. And there's only a few. There's a small remnant of people that are boldly ready to take the promises that God has for them, regardless of what stands in their way. And as we've gone through the book of Malachi, we just finished a really long time talking about money and the corruption of the church. But the corruption of the church goes much deeper than that. It's not just about the money. Now, the reason that they are corrupt and the reason that they spend the way they do and the reason they take the sacrifices of the altar and consume it for themselves is because they are fearing the world. They're too afraid to lean on God. And as we go to the book of Malachi, we're hitting a place in this book where it's all about your relationship with God. So we're going to pick it up in Malachi 3, verse 13. Your words have been harsh against me, says the Lord. Yet you say, what have we spoken against you? You have said, it is vain to serve God. What profit is it that we have kept His ordinance, and that we have walked as mourners before the Lord of hosts? So now we call the proud blessed, for those who do wickedness are raised up. Yes, those who tempt God go free. Then those who feared the Lord spoke to one another, and the Lord listened and heard them. So a book of remembrance was written before Him, for those who fear the Lord and who meditate on His name. They shall be mine, says the Lord of hosts, on the day that I make them my jewels. There's really, in my opinion, two people that have this relationship with God. There's two types of people. There's people that are scared. They're too afraid of the world, so they hoard money, they hoard things, they become enslaved in the thing that feeds them. And there's people that are promise takers. So there's cowards and wilderness wanderers, and then there's promise takers. And we've seen this exact thing, trying to understand, well, what does this relationship look like? Well, we've seen this exact type of relationship. If we go all the way back, because, who is God talking to here? Well, He's talking to the Jews. He's talking to the priests. And if we go all the way back to when all this relationship with the Jews began, God had set them free from enslavement in Egypt. And even though He performed miracle after miracle after miracle to show them how He's going to take care of them, they still were afraid. And when they finally got to the promised land that He had given Abraham thousands of years prior, they finally get there, and they sent in 12 spies. And this is a fascinating story, because what we're going to see is we're going to see a clear definition between cowardly wilderness wanderers who want slavery because it feeds them, versus bold, promise-taking Christians who are willing to go fight whatever it takes to get that promise that God has for them, because it is the enemy that's trying to keep you from that promise. So we're going to go all the way back to Numbers. We're going to start in 13, and we're going to pick it up right where they're sending in these 12 spies in 17. So Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan, and said to them, go up this way into the south and go up to the mountains, and see what the land is like, whether the people who dwell in it are strong or weak, few or many, whether the land they dwell in is good or bad, whether the cities they inhabit are like camps or strongholds, whether the land is rich or poor, and whether there are forces there or not. Be of good courage, and bring some of the fruit of the land. Now the time was the season of the first ripe grapes. So they go in the land, and they spy for 40 days. And we're going to pick it up where they come back in 26. So they departed and came back to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the children of Israel in the wilderness of Paran and Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruits of the land. They told him and said, "We went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong, the cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there." So ultimately what they're saying is, we went to the land. It was exactly like God said it was, just like he told you, Moses, exactly how he told all of us, just like he told Abraham thousands of years prior to this. It is exactly like he said. However, guess who's there? Enemies are there, and they're strong. Well, of course the enemies are strong, because the enemy is always trying to keep you from your promise. So what is their response to this? We'll pick it up in 30. Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and take possession. We are well able to overcome it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land, which they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone as spies is the land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw giants. The descendants of Anak came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." Then all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron. And the whole congregation said to them, "If only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we have died in the wilderness. Why has the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt?" So they said to one another, "Let us select a leader and return to Egypt." So ultimately what they're saying is, it's better to be enslaved than it is to face these things they're pretty darn scary. It's better to be enslaved. And what we see in the church today is we see exactly that. Moses sent in 12 spies. 2 of them were promise-taking Christians. The other 10 were wilderness wanderers. They would rather go back into slavery because that's what feeds them. And what we see in the church is, it's a spiritual war. It's always been about a spiritual war. That's why the enemy put giants in their way. It's always going to be that way. Every time, right before you receive the promise of God, there's going to be something big in your way. And there's 2 types of people. There's one that says, that is too big. I'm going to turn and walk away and go back to this mediocrity that the enemy says is the best I can have. Or there's other people that they just go conquer it. And they easily conquer it because God said this is a promise. If he promises you something, of course he's going to fulfill. And because the churches live this life of fear, because they live a life of fear, they're hoarding the finances. The only ministry that they really have that's viable is the Sunday show. They're not reaching the hungry. They're not reaching the widows. They're not reaching the orphans. They're not clothing the naked. Why? Because there's strongholds in the way of being able to do that. It's too hard. It takes too much money, and we can't let go of any of this precious, precious money. And that's really in the problem. And when you are in the middle of a spiritual war, when people look at a spiritual war, there's a few different ways you can go about a spiritual war. Most people, when they talk about a spiritual war, they're talking about they're under attack. They're under this attack. They don't know what to do. They're constantly getting battered by the enemy. All sorts of things are being devoured and destroyed around them. And then there's this other type of spiritual war where it's more you're on the assault. You're on the offense. You're ready to go. The spiritual war that those 2 spies were interested in was going and assaulting the land, going on the offense. The spiritual war that the other group was focused on was the defense. Like, let's pull back. Let's kind of go to where it's safe. Slavery is safe. Mediocrity is safe. And that's why churches hoard the finances. That's why this relationship piece follows in Malachi right after God talks about the finances, because it's about fear. It's this inability to go conquer the thing that God said. Jesus tells us in Matthew 24, when the descendants ask about when he returns, what will that judgment day look like? And he gets way into Matthew 25, for 2 whole chapters, he gives example after example after example of what this looks like. It's about being in charge of something that God has put you in charge of as a steward, as a servant, as a son or daughter of God, and you take that thing and you do what the Father said to do with it, or you take it and you hoard it because you're scared that you're not going to get any more. That's what all those stories that Jesus shared are about. And then what happens in the end of Matthew 25 is he said, there's going to be a day where I return and I separate the sheep from the goats. Or just like in this story, I separate the promise takers from the wilderness wanderers. Because it's really about this dependency on God. You know, as we continue into this story, well, what does God do? Well, he says, verse 11, chapter 14, and the Lord said to Moses, how long will these people reject me? And how long will they not believe me with all the signs which I have performed among them? And ultimately, as a result, what he does is he says, anybody over 20 now, you're going to wander the wilderness for 40 years. And as soon as everybody above 20, except for those 2 spies, Aaron and Joshua, everybody else, when your body is dead and your carcass is rotting in the wilderness, and only the people that are below 20 at this moment, only those people will enter into the promised land, because that whole generation was broken. He had to raise up a whole new generation of people. That's where our church is today. It's broken. And God's having to raise up a whole other generation of people. Going back to Malachi 3, I'm going to start in 16. Then those who feared the Lord spoke to one another, and the Lord listened and heard them. So a book of remembrance was written before him for those who fear the Lord and who meditate on his name. That is the difference. Why are some strong and courageous? Why are some weak and cowardly? It's this. This is the definition of the differences in these spiritual wars between people. This is the definition. It's the relationship that you have with God. If you are speaking against him, and a lot of people, you go to the Sunday show, they don't speak out against God, but in a way they do, because they're showing you with their actions. Like their voices are saying they will stand up for God. Their voices are saying they're willing to face giants for God, but their actions are showing that they don't depend on him at all. Their actions are showing that they depend on the world. They depend on the slavery. They depend on Egypt. They depend on the money. That's why they hoard it. We wouldn't hoard money if we believed God was a good provider. We wouldn't consume the sacrifice of the altar if we knew how precious the sacrifice of the altar was to God. This is the difference, this relationship piece. And when you're the type of spiritual warrior where you're on the assault, when you're on the offense, you're ready, hey, God said that's ours. Let's go take it. It's ours. He said it's ours. Let's go get it. Versus the other, they're like, whoa, there's giants over there. Let's run the other way and go back into slavery. Most Christians, most church congregations, it's filled with people that are wanting to go back into slavery. Well, why are they wanting to go back into slavery? Because the leaders are telling them they want to go back into slavery. If we look back at what happened with Moses, the people didn't see the giants. They were told about the giants. It was the leaders, the ones speaking up, talking about how they should be afraid. It was the ones murmuring, hey, let's go pick new leaders. And when you go to a church, you can just see it. When you see that people are just suffering, they're just getting beat up left and right from the enemy because they're not engaged in the spiritual war on an offense. They're engaged in a spiritual war on the defense. It's because that's how the leaders are showing them to fight. They're showing them to fight that way. That's how they're showing them to do it. They're telling them they should be afraid. And they're telling them to be afraid because the people aren't seeing miracles in their churches. The people aren't seeing people get healed. The people aren't seeing the hungry be fed. People aren't seeing the widows being taken care of. So they're not seeing it. All they're seeing is they're seeing a Sunday show, and then maybe there's some sort of meal afterwards, and then they go home, and then they're getting pounded on by the enemy for 6 days. This is the life of the church, and God's going to have to just let their carcasses rot in the desert and bring up a whole new generation of people. And the few, the very few that stand for God and are willing to take that thing that God has promised them, it says in Verse 17, they shall be mine, says the Lord of hosts, one day, that I make them my jewels. And he writes your name in the book of remembrance. I mean, how great would it be to get to heaven and not just get there because your name was written in the book, the Lamb's Book of Life, because a lot of people, a lot of wilderness wandering Christians, their name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life, but they're wilderness wanderers. They're enslaved. They're scared. They're too afraid to take the promises, but their name is still written in the Lamb's Book of Life. How great would it be to show up in that small little book, a much smaller book, the Book of Remembrance? Your name's written right in there, and God calls you his jewel. That's what it's about. That's what it's all about. And churches aren't preaching this. Churches aren't talking about this. They're kind of just filling you with warm fuzzies. They're tickling your ears, asking you to throw in some money in the pot. And then they're consuming the sacrifice of the altar, and then they just repeat. Just like the Jews in the wilderness, they just repeat. They just wandered around. That's all they did for 40 years. They wandered around, and then one would drop dead. Another one would drop dead. A couple years go by, more are dropping dead. And eventually, after 40 years, there was this whole new generation of promise takers. And you know what they did? They went in and they took it with ease, just like God said they would. They could have done that 40 years earlier. The problem was the people. The problem was the leaders of the people. If you're not seeing miracles in your church, you're not seeing hungry get fed, you're not seeing the widows being taken care of, and you're not seeing the orphans being taken care of, and you're not seeing the homeless being taken care of, all you're seeing is a Sunday show, you're a wilderness wandering Christian and you're at a wilderness wandering church. I highly recommend you grab a hold of a couple of those spies that are saying, you know what, this is the promise God said we could have. If he promised it, of course we can have it. I don't care how many giants are standing there. I don't care how many mountains are in between me and that promise. God said it's mine. I'm going to take it. I'm not interested in slavery. You know what God thinks of people like that? He calls them jewels. He writes your name in a book of remembrance. This is the problem of the church. My fear is that we're going to have to watch a whole generation die out before we can finally see the church do what it was really meant to do. I'm going to recommend everybody watching this video just really think about your church, think about your life. Like, are you a promise-taking Christian? You know, because there really are. I've been in spiritual wars. You know, when you're on the offense of a spiritual war and you're running off in a battle and you're off to take that promise that God has promised you, and there's all these giants, you're ready to take them. You're in the charge mode. You're surrounded by thousands and thousands and thousands of Christians, but once you start charging, there's only one or two around you. The rest of them, they're not going. They're not willing to go off the fight, but guess what? They're still in a fight. They're just getting beat up because they're on the defense. But when you go and you charge off to battle, and you know that you are charging off into a promise that God has promised you, look around. You're either by yourself, or there's only one or two with you. The rest of those people that are at your church, the rest of those people that are in your neighborhood, or the rest of the people that say, oh yeah, we're all about that spiritual war, they're not in a spiritual war. I mean, they're on a spiritual they're in spiritual enslavement is what they are. They're too afraid to take that promise. Only a few, it's only a small, tiny few that are willing and go take that. And the only way that we can get past that, I'm afraid, is God's just going to have to raise up a whole other generation. This generation, they can't. They're totally incapable of it. I mean, I'm just here in Missouri. Your churches, they're all over the country and all over the world, and you're all sharing with me. The same with my church. I mean, they're not doing anything. They're just sitting there doing the Sunday show, acting like they're engaged in a spiritual war, but they're not. Giving a 45-minute speech once a week is not a spiritual war. A spiritual war means you are on the ground, fighting on the front lines, day after day after day after day, whether it takes years until you finally get to that promise that God promised you. People aren't willing to do that. As for me, I want to be called a jewel. I absolutely want my name written in the book of remembrance, because when God says there's a promise, I'm willing to take it. And you could always tell who's willing to take it. It's those that are willing to lay down the money. I don't need this money here. Give it to the orphans. Give it to the widows. Give it to the hungry, because we have a war to fight. There's wars to be fought here. There's promises to be taken here. versus the rest. Hey, I showed up, I watched the Sunday show, and maybe had a nice lunch afterwards, and I went home. That's what I'm willing to do. That is not a spiritual war at all. That is not. That is just spiritual enslavement, is all that is. Take a moment, really pray about this. Really pray, are you on the offense? If you're on the defense, and I've been in spiritual wars where I'm on the defense too. I'm not saying just because you're defending yourself doesn't mean you're a coward. But when you're defending yourself to the point where you're tired of shooting from the hip and you're really to just say, you know what, I'm tired of this. We're going on the offense, regardless of how hard it is. That's where it's at, because that's exactly where all those Jews were in the wilderness. It was hard in the wilderness. Everything was hard. They've been fighting for 20, 30 years at that point. They were tired of fighting. And I get it. But there were a few that said, God said this is ours, let's go take it. They go into the book of remembrance. The rest of them that said, oh, it's way better, and at least they fed us when we were in slavery. Because that's really kind of what we're doing. Hey, at least, go to church. At least they're feeding us there. But if your church is on the offense, and you'll know that church will be written in the book of remembrance. And there's not many out there. I know there's a few. There's not many. But my fear is that we're just going to have to raise up a whole other generation. And this church age that we're in right now is just going to have to just die and rot in the wilderness. Love to hear your thoughts on it. Put it in the comments below. If you like this video, click like and subscribe. If you feel called to support this channel through Patreon, that link is also below. And we're now on Instagram. That link's below as well. But by far, the most important part of this channel is we take prayer requests. Never, ever hesitate to send that in, especially if you're in the middle of a spiritual war and you're on the offense or the defense. Thank you for watching this episode of God, Family, Guns. And as always, love God, love your family, and love guns.